It just became too much of a problem.
The number of barbarian raids steadily increased throughout the 200s AD. Rome's borders were simply not as secure as they had been in earlier times, and a major reason lay in the east. A revitalized Persian Empire began retaliating to centuries' worth of Roman raids and pushed into Roman territory. In the year 260 AD, the Persians even captured the Roman Emperor Valerian on their own territory and kept him prisoner for life.
It's the Persian attacks on the eastern frontier that act, as it were, like the first domino in a series. Rome is forced to fight a series of very expensive defensive wars. No longer can war be funded by booty extracted from conquered people. This time the empire, from its own resources, has to pay for the defense of its own frontiers.
Having to shift troops to the east to fight the Persians left Rome's other borders less secure. There were constant raids, especially from German tribes, who in one battle killed the Roman Emperor Decius in the year 251 AD. There were invasions of Roman Gaul and the Balkans, and Italy itself was invaded several times in the 260s AD. The raids tested the logistics of the Roman army to the limit.
The gathering of the troops and the going to the frontier takes place at walking pace, so no more than 20 miles a day. To put together a sizable force, get it to the right bit of the frontier, you're certainly talking weeks and maybe months.
And there was another problem for the Romans. The barbarian tribes that Caesar and others had defeated so easily had nevertheless learned a great deal from the Romans and were now ready to turn the tables. When Rome was building its empire, its ruthless and disciplined army was almost unbeatable against the often disorganized barbarian enemies. But by the 200s AD, things were changing. For centuries, many barbarians had been part of the Roman army, recruited by Rome to fight alongside the legions. Now, that was beginning to backfire, as barbarian tribes used their newfound skills to fight for their own peoples against the empire.
Very many of their warriors have, at one time or another, served in the Roman army. They're getting much more familiar with Roman tactics, and to some extent they're starting to imitate them as well. Therefore, it's a much more difficult task for the Romans to cope with.
But the threats were not just external. The Roman legions, now under great pressure, turned to fighting with each other throughout the 200s AD, each wanting to put its own candidate on the emperor's throne. The infighting was so great that more than 30 different emperors were proclaimed in a period of 50 years.
Very many soldiers were killed unnecessarily, huge amounts of treasure were wasted, and the destruction, which may have been quite localized within the empire, reduced the economic capacity of the Roman world to sustain the army which defended it. So in a way, the army, to some extent, cut its own throat.
The Roman fort at Salzburg in Germany was just one of the many that fell into enemy hands during the 200s AD as barbarian tribes swept across the border. The nature of the Roman military strategy was changing. In the early days of the empire, the army had been on the attack, conquering new territory and paying for its wars with captured treasure. But now, the empire and its army were operating defensively. Even women and children were called on at times to help the army defend a town from attack, and many cities began building walls to try to keep the invaders out.
So it's no surprise, by the 270s, a Roman emperor actually gives the word Rome has got to have an enormous city wall, such as it hadn't had for 600 years.
The style of forts was changing too. At the height of the empire, forts were often built in open ground to allow the army easy access and domination of the area. But by the late 200s AD, Roman forts like this one at Porchester in southern England were designed much more defensively, with many more towers for artillery and archers against barbarian attack. in this case, raids by Saxon fleets.
The importance of this fort is that it symbolizes a fundamental change that overtakes Roman military strategy in the 3rd century. The big D-shaped bastions behind me represent a shift from an offensive to a defensive posture. What this fort symbolizes, I think, is a change in an empire that's go-getting, that's aggressive, that's prepared to move out and expand, and rather change to an empire that's back on its heels, that's defensive, that's preparing not to expand, but is sitting and preparing to fight for its survival.
By the late 200s AD, it looked as though the empire might be finished. But from the revolving door of changing emperors emerged 2 strong leaders who put the empire back on a solid footing. The first of them was Diocletian.
Diocletian is certainly one of the most capable emperors. Remarkably, he rose up from a peasant class to rule. This in of itself is a tribute to the army as a means of social advancement. Diocletian rose up due to his skill as a soldier and as a commander. He transferred this skill into a reorganization of the empire.
When Diocletian became emperor in 284 AD, he restored the dwindling army to its former size, about 400,000 troops. He also turned the emperor's job into a committee. He appointed 3 other emperors, and the 4 of them, called the Tetrarchy, ruled the empire jointly. After Diocletian retired voluntarily, the Tetrarchy system fell apart as a result of internal bickering, and then another strong soldier emperor, Constantine, took control. In 312 AD, he won the civil war in a pivotal battle outside Rome. Although badly outnumbered, he won after claiming to see a vision of the cross in the noonday sky and hearing the words, "Conquer by this." Once he became emperor, he made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Constantine continued Diocletian's military reforms. He created a mobile army to back up the frontier garrisons. These field units could rush to resist trouble wherever it broke out.
A central reserve, a mobile reserve, as well as having the troops all around the frontiers. Now, this was something which the Romans should have had before. If that had been in place in a serious way at the beginning of the 3rd century, they would have been able to react rapidly. As it was, to send troops from the northern frontier to the eastern frontier, or vice versa, it just didn't work.
Constantine also created a new capital for the empire, moving away from Rome in the year 330 AD to the new Christian capital of Constantinople, now known as Istanbul in Turkey. This was a sign that the wealth and power of the empire were shifting to the east, and that the Western Empire was heading for decline. Sadly, the new stability that Diocletian and Constantine had given the army and the empire largely died with them. The middle 300s AD saw a return to civil wars between the legions, each one wanting its commander to be emperor. Civil wars had the effect of weakening not only the army, but the economy too. Roman writers spoke of many farms lying waste.
The peasants have been frightened away, or the peasants have been conscripted into the army, or the peasants have run away because they don't want to go into the army, or because they have no money to pay taxes and they fear the consequences.
The constant civil wars also had the effect of creating rampant inflation throughout the empire.
Every time there's an attempt at becoming emperor, successful or otherwise, enormous numbers of extra coins are minted and distributed as a reward to the troops. When you get such an enormous number of coins in circulation, clearly prices shoot up.
Basically what happens is people start losing confidence because this denarius is supposed to be silver, and they gradually put in more and more non-silver into it, until by the latter part of the 3rd century, the so-called denarius has perhaps 2% silver in it.
Barbarian invaders took full advantage of the empire's internal problems. In Britain, tribes from Scotland stormed across Hadrian's Wall in the 360s AD. On the European mainland, German tribes were threatening, especially the Goths, who came from near the Black Sea. They were being driven from their homelands by fierce, bloodthirsty nomads, the Huns from Central Asia. To escape the Huns, the Goths begged for refuge inside the Roman Empire.
The Goths are fleeing from the Huns, and they are clearly scared to death. And the Romans accept this explanation, the Romans actually ferry them across the Danube. So sometimes barbarians are simply running away from other barbarians.
But after he allowed the Goths to settle, the Roman Emperor, Valens, decided he wanted them out. In 378 AD, he personally led an army against them at Adrianople, north of Constantinople. It was a disastrous mistake. Acting on bad intelligence, the Romans were pinned between two Gothic armies.
The story as it goes is that they can't use their weapons. They're trapped, they can't turn around, and they're massacred. 2/3 of the army, I think about 12,000 men, are killed on that one day.
The dead included the emperor, Valens. More importantly, the loss of so many troops at once weakened the Romans' capacity to defend the empire.
Because at Adrianople so many very important regiments were destroyed, the Roman army was never able actually to replace them in terms of either quality or quantity. So its military capacity overall was that much reduced. It was therefore unable properly to defend all of the frontiers thereafter.
Now the Romans were forced to let the Goths stay, and other barbarian tribes were allowed to settle too, provided they joined the Roman army. Rome had always used and trained foreign troops, but now barbarian armies were being conscripted wholesale to fight with the Romans.
The real problem with barbarians is not individual barbarians in Roman units. It's when they come in large numbers and are employed by the Roman state en masse, as it were, without going through Roman military training.
The so-called barbarization of the Roman army was only one part of the problem. In the army as a whole, the once proud standards were beginning to fall away. Waging war costs money. As the Roman Empire's economy weakened under the weight of invasions and civil wars, some sections of the Roman army could no longer afford to train and equip their soldiers as well as before. Armor and weapons, for example, the classic Roman helmet, were no longer standard.
They didn't have the technology, because technology means money, and money was short. So they just used what they could. And with this sort of thing, you just hammer out two halves like an Easter egg and then put them together with this. So basically, although you're trying to keep to a standard of design, the actual technical ability of them produce this.
In some cases, the Roman armor of earlier times, like chain mail or segmented armor, gave way to cruder examples.
The links of mail are difficult to produce. They were mostly riveted. So we got to this sort of period where these blokes were finding alternatives to mail and the plate. So stamping out or cutting out small links and basically sewing them together with leather will produce something that's basically stab-proof and hack-proof for a limited military engagement.
Archaeological evidence found in the frontier forts suggests a decline in standards.
It doesn't matter whether it's the quality of the currency, the jewelry, the armor, the style of the buildings. It's all becomes rougher and cheaper as the centuries wear on. It's no great surprise, I don't think, but it's just reflecting really what is happening in Rome.
As the Western Empire began to slide, recruitment for the army became much more difficult. The minimum height requirement was lowered from 5'8" to 5'5", but service, once considered an honor, was now often avoided at almost any cost.
People cutting off their thumbs to render themselves ineligible for military service, and all sorts of things case of this evading military service, but not just by the